Chapter 10 of Mr Prohack by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 10. The Theory of Idleness. 1. Within the next 7 days Mr Prohack had reason to lose confidence in himself as an expert in human nature. After all, he reflected, I must have been a very simple-minded man to have thought that I thoroughly understood another human being. Every human being is infinite, and will beat your understanding in the end. The reference, of course, was to his wife. Since the automobile accident she had become another person, and a more complex person. The climax, or what seemed to be the climax, came one cold morning when she and Mr Prohack and Sissy and Dr Vega were sitting together in the little boudoir beyond the bedroom. They were packed in there because Eve, otherwise Marian, had taken a fancy to the sofa. Eve was relating to the admired and trusting doctor all her peculiar mental and moral symptoms. She was saying that she could no longer manage the house, could not concentrate her mind on anything, could not refrain from strange caprices, could not remain calm, could not keep her temper, and was the worst conceivable wife for such a paragon as Arthur Prohack. Her daughter alone had saved the household organism from a catastrophe. Her daughter Sissy, "Come here, Sissy." Sissy obeyed the call, and was suddenly embraced by her mother with deep tenderness. This in front of the doctor. Still more curious was the fact that Sissy, of late her mother's frigid critic, came forward and responded to the embrace almost effusively. The spectacle was really touching. It touched Mr Prohack, who yet felt as if the floor had yielded under his feet, and he was falling into the tube railway underground. Indeed, Mr Prohack had never had such sensations as drew and caught at him then. "Well," said Dr Vega to Mrs Prohack in his philosophical, realistic manner, "I've been marking time for a week. I shall now proceed to put you right. You can't sleep. You will sleep tonight. I shall send you something. I suppose it isn't your fault that you've taken the digestive tonic I sent you last thing at night under the impression that it was a sedative, in spite of the label. But it is regrettable. As for your headaches, I will provide a pleasing potion. As for this sad lack of application, don't attempt application. As for your strange caprices, indulge them. One thing is essential. You must go away to the sea. You must go to Frinton-on-Sea. It is an easy journey. There is a Pullman car on the morning train, and the air is unrivalled for your, shall I say, idiosyncrasy." "Yes, darling mother," said Sissy, "you must go away, and father and I will take you." "Of course," confirmed Mr Prohack, with an imitation of pettishness, as they had been steadily advocating a change of scene for days past. But he had done nothing of the kind. "Oh," Eve cried piteously, "that is the one thing I can't do." Dr Vega laughed. "Afraid of the expense, I suppose?" "No," Eve answered with seriousness. "My husband has just made a very fortunate investment, which means a profit of at least £100,000, like that." She snapped her fingers and laughed lightly. Here was another point to puzzle an expert in human nature. Instead of being extremely incredulous and apprehensive about the vast speculation with Sir Paul, Eve had in truth accepted it for a gold mine. She did not assume satisfaction. She really was satisfied. Her satisfaction was absurd, and nothing that Mr Prohack could say would diminish it. She had already begun to spend the financial results of the speculation with enormous verve. For instance, she had hired another eagle, to take the place of the wounded eagle, without uttering a word to her husband of what she had done. Mr Prohack could see the dregs of his bank balance, and in a dream he had had glimpses of a sinister edifice at the bottom of a steep slope, the building being the bankruptcy court. "Is it a railway strike you're afraid of?" demanded Dr Vega cruelly. And Eve replied with sweetness, "I can't leave London until my son Charlie comes back from Glasgow, and he's written me to say he'll be here next week." A first-rate example this of her new secretiveness. She had said absolutely nothing to Mr Prohack about a letter from Charlie. "When did you hear that?" Mr Brack might well have asked, but he was too loyal to her to betray her secretiveness by such a question. He did not wish the Portuguese quack to know that he, the husband, was kept in the dark about anything whatever. He had his ridiculous dignity, had Mr. Prohack, and all his motives were mixed motives. Not a perfectly pure motive in the whole of his volitional existence. However, Sissy put the question in her young blundering way. "Oh, mother dear, you never told us." "I received the letter the day before yesterday," Eve continued gravely, "and Charlie is certainly not coming home to find me away." For 2 entire days she had had the important letter and had concealed it. Mr. Prohack was disturbed. "Oh, very well," Dr. Vega concurred. "It doesn't really matter whether you go to Frinton now or next month, or even next year but one. You're a powerful woman, and you'll last a long time yet, especially if you don't worry. I won't call for about a week, and if you'd like to consult another doctor, do." He smiled at her in an avuncular manner, and rose. Whereupon Mr. Prohack also jumped up. "I'm not worrying," she protested, with a sweet, pathetic, answering smile. "Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I'm worrying because I know I'm worrying my poor husband." She went quickly to her poor husband and kissed him lavishly. Eve was an artist in kissing, and never a greater artist than at the moment. And now Mr. Prohack, though still to the physical eye a single individual, became 2 Mr. Prohacks. There was the Mr. Prohack who strongly deprecated this departure from the emotional reserve, which is one of the leading and sublimest characteristics of the British governing class. And there was the Mr. Prohack, all nerves and heart and humanity, who profoundly enjoyed the demonstration of a woman's affection, disordered and against the rules though the demonstration might be. The first Mr. Prohack blushed and hated himself for blushing. The second was quite simply enraptured and didn't care who knew it. "Dr. Vega," Eve appealed, clinging to Mr. Prohack's coat, "it is my husband who needs looking after. He's not making any progress, and it is my fault. And let me tell you that you've been neglecting him for me." She was a dramatic figure of altruism, of the everlasting sacrificial feminine. She was quite possibly absurd, but beyond doubt she was magnificent. Mr. Prohack felt ashamed of himself, and the more ashamed because he considered that he was in quite tolerable health. "Mother," murmured Sissy, with the sweetness of which Mr. Prohack had imagined her to be utterly incapable, "come and sit down." And Eve, guided by her daughter, the callous, home-deserting dancing mistress, came and sat down. 2. "My dear sir," said Dr. Vega, "there is nothing at all to cause alarm. She will gradually recover, believe me." He and Mr. Prohack and Sissy were conspiring together in the dining-room, the drawing-room being at that hour and on that day under the dominion of servants with brushes. "But what's the matter with her? What is it?" "Merely neurasthenia, traumatic neurasthenia." "But what's that?" Mr. Prohack spoke low, just as though his wife could overhear from the boudoir above, and was listening to them under the impression that they were plotting against her life. "It's a morbid condition due to a violent shock." "But how? You told me the other day that it was purely physical." "Well," said Dr. Vega, "it is because it must be. But I assure you that if a post-mortem were to be held on Mrs. Prohack—" "Oh, doctor, please!" Sissy stopped him resentfully. The doctor paused and then continued, "There would be no trace of any morbid condition in any of the organs." "Then how do you explain it?" "We don't explain it," cried Dr. Vega, suddenly throwing the onus on the whole medical profession. "We can't. We don't know." "It's very, very unsatisfactory, all this ignorance." "It certainly is. But did you suppose that medical science, alone among all sciences, had achieved finality and omniscience? We've reached the state of knowing that we don't know, and that's something. I hope I'm not flattering you by talking like this. I only do it to people whom I suspect to be intelligent. But, of course, if you prefer the omniscient bedside manner, you can have it without extra charge." Mr. Prohack thought, frightened, "I shall be making a friend of this quack soon, if I'm not careful." "And, by the way, about your health," Dr. Vega proceeded, after having given further assurances as to his other patient. "Mrs. Prohack was perfectly correct. You're not making progress. The fact is, you're bored. You haven't organized your existence, and the lack of organization is reacting on your health." "Something is reacting on his health," Sissy put in. "I'm not at all pleased." She was now not Mr. Prohack's daughter, but his aunt. "How can I organise my existence?" Mr. Prohack burst out crossly. "I haven't got any existence to organise. I haven't got anything to do. I thought I had too much to do the other day. Illusion. Of course I'm bored. I feel all right, but bored I am, and it's your fault." "It is," the doctor admitted. "It is my fault. I took you for a person of common sense, and so I didn't tell you that 2 and 2 makes 4, and a lot more important things of the same sort. I ought to have told you. You've taken on the new profession of being idle. It's essential for you, but you aren't treating it seriously. You have to be a professionally idle man, which means that you haven't got a moment to spare. When I advised you to try idleness, I didn't mean you to be idle idly. That's worse than useless. You've got to be idle busily. You aren't doing half enough. Do you ever have a Turkish bath?" "No, never could bear the idea of them." "Well, you will kindly take 2 Turkish baths a week. You can be massaged at the same time. A Turkish bath is as good as a day's hunting as far as exercise goes, but you must have more exercise. Do you dance? I see you don't. You had better begin dancing. There is no finer exercise. I absolutely prescribe it." At this juncture Mr. Prohack was rather relieved that the sound of an unaccustomed voice in the hall drew his daughter out of the dining-room. When she had gone, Dr. Vega went on in a more confidential tone. "There's another point. An idle man who really knows his business will visit his tailors, his hosiers, his bootmakers, his barbers more oftener and much more conscientiously than you do. You've got a mind above clothes, of course. So have I. I take a wicked pleasure in being picturesquely untidy. But I'm not a patient. My life is a great lark. Yours isn't. Yours is serious. You have now a serious profession, idleness. Bring your mind down to clothes. I say this partly because to be consistently well dressed means much daily expenditure of time, and partly because really good clothes have a distinctly curative effect on the patient who wears them. Then again—" Mr. Prohack was conscious of a sudden joyous uplifting of the spirit. "Here," said he, interrupting Dr. Vega with a grand gesture, "have a cigar." "I cannot, my friend." Dr. Vega looked at his watch. "You must have a Corona." Mr. Prohack moved to the cigar cabinet which he had recently purchased. "No, my next patient is awaiting me in Hyde Park Gardens at this moment." "Let him die!" exclaimed Mr. Prohack ruthlessly. "You've got to have a cigar with me. Look, I'll compromise. I'll make it a half Corona. You can charge me as if for another consultation." The doctor's foreign eyes twinkled as he sat down and struck a match. "You thought I was a quack," he said maliciously, and maliciously he seemed to intensify his foreign accent. "I did," admitted Mr. Prohack with candour. "So I am," said Dr. Vega, "but I'm a fully qualified quack, and all really good doctors are quacks. They have to be. They wouldn't be worth anything if they weren't. Medicine owes a great deal to quacks." "Tell me something about one of your cases," said Mr. Prohack imperatively. "You're one of the most interesting men I've ever met. So now you know. We want some of your blood transfused into the English character. You've got a soul above medicine as well as clothes." "All good doctors have," said Dr. Vega. "My life is a romance." "And so shall mine be," said Mr. Prohack. 3. When at length Mr. Prohack escorted Dr. Vega out into the hall, he saw Sissy kissing Eliza Brating with much affection on the front doorstep. They made an elegant group for a moment, and then Eliza Brating departed hurriedly, disappearing across the street behind Dr. Vega's attendant car. "Now I'll just repeat once more to both of you," resumed Dr. Vega, embracing father and daughter in one shrewd glance. "You've nothing to worry about upstairs." He indicated the boudoir by a movement of his somewhat tousled head. "But you've got just a little to worry about here," and he indicated Mr. Prohack. "I know," said Sissy with assurance, "but I shall look after him, Doctor. You can rely on me. I understand both cases." "Well, there's one good thing," said Sissy, following her father into the dining-room after the doctor had gone. "I've done with that foolish Eliza. I knew it couldn't last, and it hasn't. Unless I'm there all the time to keep my eye on everything, Of course it all goes to pieces. That girl is the biggest noodle. But haven't I just seen you and her joined in the deepest affection? Oh, naturally I had to kiss her, but I've finished with her. And what's more, she knows what I think of her. She never liked me. Sissy, said Mr. Prohack, you shock me. And indeed he was genuinely shocked, for he had always thought that Sissy was different from other girls, that she had all the feminine qualities without any of the feminine defects. Yes, he had thought that she might develop into a creature more perfect even than Marian. And here she was talking and behaving exactly as men at the club would relate of their own conventional women. Sissy gazed firmly at her father, as if it were half in pity and half in disdain. Did the innocent fellow not then understand the nature of women? Or was he too sentimental to admit it, too romantic to be a realist? "Would you believe," said Sissy, "that although I was there last night and told her exactly what to do, she's had a quarrel this morning with the landlord of the studio? Well, she has. You know the ARA on the first floor has been making a lot of silly complaints about the noise, music and so on, every night. And some other people have complained. I could have talked the landlord round in 10 minutes. Eliza doesn't merely not talk him round, she quarrels with him. Of course it's all up. And if that wasn't enough, a county council inspector has been round asking about a music and dancing licence. We shall either have to give up business altogether, or else move somewhere else. Eliza says she knows of another studio. Well, I shall write to her tonight and tell her she can have my share of the fittings and furniture and go where she likes, but I shan't go with her. And if she never liked me, I can honestly say I never liked her. And I don't want to run a dancing studio any more either. Why should I, after all? We were the new poor. Now we're the new rich. Well, we may as well be the new rich." Mr. Prohack was now still more shocked. Nay, he was almost frightened. And yet he wasn't either shocked or frightened in the centre of his soul. He was rather triumphant, not about his daughter with the feet of clay, but about himself. "But I shan't give up teaching dancing entirely," said Sissy. "No?" He wondered what would come next. "No, I shall teach you." "Indeed you won't." He instinctively recoiled. "Yes, I shall. I promised the doctor he could rely on me. You'll buy a gramophone, and we'll have the carpet up in the drawing-room. Oh, you startled dear, do you want to run back into the depths of the forest? Father, you are the funniest father that ever was." She marched to him and put her hand on his shoulder and just twitched his beard. "I can look after you quite as well as Mother can. We're pals, aren't we?" "Yes, like the tiger and the lamb. You've got hold of my silky fleece already." 4. Mr. Prohack sat in the dining-room alone. The room was now heated by an electric radiator which Eve had just bought for the sake of economy. But her economy was the economy of the rich, for the amount of expensive current consumed by that radiator was prodigious, while the saving it effected in labour, cleanliness, and atmospheric purity could certainly not have been measured without a scientific instrument adapted to the infinitely little. Still, Martian admired and loved it. Mr. Brack perceived that all 4 bars of it were brightly incandescent, whereas 3 bars would have been ample to keep the room warm. He ought to get up and turn a bar off. He had 100 preoccupations. His daughter had classed him with the new rich. He resented the description, but could he honestly reject it? All his recent troubles sprang from the new riches. If he had not inherited from a profiteer, he would assuredly have been at his office in the Treasury, earning an honest living, at that very moment. For only sick persons of plenteous independent means are ever prescribed for, as he had been prescribed for. The others either go on working and making the best of such health as is left to them, or they die. If he had not inherited from a profiteer, he would not have had a car, and the car would not have had an accident, and he would not have been faced with the prospect, as he was faced with it, of a legal dispute, to be fought by him on behalf of the insurance company with the owner of the colliding car. The owner of the colliding car was a young woman, as to whose veracity Carthew had yet had some exceedingly hard things to say. Mr. Prohack would have settled the matter, but neither Eve nor the insurance company would let him settle it. And if the car had not had an accident, Eve would not have had her traumatic neurasthenia, with all its disconcerting reactions on family life, and if he had not inherited from a profiteer, Charlie would not have gone off to Glasgow. He had heard odds and ends of strange tales as to Charlie's doings in Glasgow, not in the least reassuring. And if he had not inherited from a profiteer, Sissy would not have taken a share in a dancing studio, and might never have dangerously danced with that worm Oswald Murphy. And if he had not inherited from a profiteer, he would not have been speculating, with a rich chance of more profiteering, in Romanian oil with Paul Spinner. In brief, well, he ought to get up and turn off a bar of that wasteful radiator. Yet he was uplifted, happy. Not because of his wealthy ease. No. A week or two ago he had only to think of his fortune to feel uplifted and happy. But now? No, he was uplifted and happy now for the simple reason that he caught the romance of the doctor's idea of taking idleness seriously and practising it as a profession. If circumstances forced him to be idle, he would be idle in the grand manner. He would do everything that the doctor had suggested, and more. The doctor saw life like a poet. He might be a cross between a comedian and a mountebank, but he was a great fellow. Every species of idleness should have its appointed hour. In the pursuit of idleness he would become the busiest man in London. A definite programme would be necessary, strict routine would be necessary, no more loafing about. He hankered after routine as the drunkard after alcohol. Routine was what he had been missing. The absence of routine, and naught else, was retarding his memory. Yes, he knew in his heart that what they all said was true. He was not getting better. His own daughter had taught him wisdom. Inevitably, unavoidably, he was the new rich. Well, he would be the new rich thoroughly. No other aim was logical. Let the radiator burn. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Mr Prohack by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 11. Neurasthenia Cured. 1. 3 days later, Mr Prohack came home late with his daughter in the substituted car. He had accompanied Sissy to Putney for the final disposition of the affairs of the dance studio, and had witnessed her blighting politeness to Eliza Brating, and Eliza Brating's blighting politeness to her. The last kiss between these two young women would have desolated the heart of any man whose faith in human nature was less strong than Mr Prohack's. "I trust that the excellent Eliza is not disfigured for life," he had observed calmly in the automobile. "What are you talking about, father?" Sissy had exclaimed, suspicious. "I was afraid her lips might be scorched. You feel no pain yourself, my child, I hope?" He made the sound of a kiss. After this there was no more conversation in the car during the journey. Arrived home, Sissy said nonchalantly that she was going to bed. "Burn my lips first," Mr Prohack implored. "Father," said she, having kissed him, "you are simply terrible." "I am a child," he replied, "and you are my grandmother." "You wait till I give you your next dancing lesson," Sissy retorted, turning and threatening him from the stairs. "It won't be as mild as this afternoon's." He smiled, giving an imitation of the Sphinx. He was happy enough as mortals go. His wife was perhaps a little better, and he was gradually launching himself into an industrious career of idleness. Also he had broken the ice, that is to say, of tuition in dancing. Not a word had been spoken abroad in the house about the first dancing lesson. He had had it while Mrs Prohack was, in theory at least, paying calls. At any rate she had set forth in the car. Mr Prohack and Sissy had rolled up the drawing-room carpet and moved the furniture themselves. Mr Prohack had unpacked the gramophone in person. They had locked the drawing-room door. At the end of the lesson they had relaid the carpet and replaced the furniture and enclosed the gramophone and unlocked the door, and Mr Prohack had issued from the drawing-room like a criminal. The thought in his mind had been that he was no end of a dog, and of a brave dog at that. Then he sneered at himself for thinking such a foolish thought. After all, what was there in learning to dance? But the sneer was misplaced. His original notion that he had done something courageous and wonderful was just a notion. The lesson had favoured the new nascent intimacy with his daughter. Evidently she was a born teacher as well as a born dancer. He perceived in 2 minutes how marvellous her feet were. She guided him with pressures light as a feather. She allowed herself to be guided with an intuitive responsiveness that had to be felt to be believed. Her exhortations were delicious, her reprimands exquisite, her patience was infinite. Further, she said that he had what she called natural rhythm, and would learn easily and satisfactorily. Best of all, he had been immediately aware of the physical benefit of the exercise. The household was supposed to know naught of the affair, but the kitchen knew a good deal about it somehow. The kitchen was pleasantly and rather condescendingly excited, and a little censorious, for the reason that nobody in the kitchen had ever before lived in a house, the master of which, being a parent of adult children, took surreptitious lessons in dancing. The thing was unprecedented, and therefore, of course, intrinsically reprehensible. Mr. Prohack guessed the attitude of the kitchen, and had met Machin's respectful glance with a self-conscious aye. He now bolted the front door and went upstairs, extinguishing the lights after him. Eve had told her husband and child that she would go to bed early. He meant to have a frolicsome, teasing chat with her, for the doctor had laid it down that light conversation would assist the cure of traumatic neurasthenia. She would not be asleep, and even if she were asleep, she would be glad to awaken, because she admired his style of gossip when both of them were in the vein for it. He would describe for her the evening at the studio humorously, in such a fashion as to confirm in her righteous belief that the misguided Sissy had seen the maternal wisdom and quitted dance studios for ever. The lamps were out in the bedroom. She slept. He switched on a light. It had not been occupied. "Marian," he called in a low voice, thinking that she might be in the boudoir. And if she was in the boudoir, she must be reclining in the dark there. He ascertained that she was not in the boudoir. Then he visited both the drawing-room and the dining-room. No Marian anywhere. He stood for a moment in the hall, and was in a mind to ring for Machin. He could see from a vague illumination at the entrance to the basement steps that the kitchen was still inhabited. But just then all the servants came upwards on the way to the attics, and at the strange spectacle of their dancing master in the hall, they all grew constrained, and either coughed or hurried as though they ought not to be caught in the act of retiring to bed. Mr. Prohack, as it were, threw a lasso over Machin, who was the last of the procession. "Where is your mistress, Machin?" But something unusual in his tone apparently startled her. "She's gone to bed, sir. She told me to put her hot water bag in the bed early." "Oh, thanks. Good night." "Good night, sir." He could not persuade himself to call an alarm. He could not even inform Machin that she was mistaken, for to do so would have been equivalent to calling an alarm. Hesitating and inactive, he allowed the black and white damsels and the blue cook to disappear. Nor would he disturb Sissy, yet. He had first to get used to the singular idea that his wife had vanished from home. Could this vanishing be one of the effects of traumatic neurasthenia? He hurried about and searched all the rooms again, looking with absurd carefulness as if his wife were an insignificant object that might have dropped unperceived under a chair or behind a couch. Then he telephoned to her sister, inquiring in a voice of studied casualness. Eve was not at her sister's. He had known all the while that she would not be at her sister's. Being unable to recall the number, he had to consult the telephone book. His instinct now was to fetch Sissy, whose common sense had of late impressed him more and more. But he repressed the instinct, holding that he ought to be able to manage the affair alone. He could scarcely say to his daughter, "Your mother has vanished. What am I to do?" Moreover, feeling himself to be the guardian of Marian's reputation for perfect sanity, he desired not to divulge her disappearance unless obliged to do so. She might return at any moment. She might return very soon. It was inconceivable that anything should have happened in the Prohack family. Almost against his will, he looked up police stations in the telephone book. There were scores of police stations. The nearest seemed to be that of Mayfair. He demanded the number. To demand the number of the police station was just like jumping into bottomless cold water. In a detestable dream he gave his name and address, and asked if the police had any news of a street accident. Yes, several. He described his wife. He said, reflecting wildly, that she was not very tall and rather plump, dark hair. Dress? Dark blue. Hat and mantle? He could not say. Age? A queer impulse here. He knew that she hated the mention of her real age, and so he said 39. No, the police had no news of such a person. But the polite, firm voice on the wire said that it would telephone to other stations and would let Mr Prohack hear immediately if there was anything to communicate. Wonderful organisation, the London police force. As he hung up the receiver he realized what had occurred and what he had done. Marian had mysteriously disappeared, and he had informed the police. He, Arthur Prohack, C.B. What an awful event! His mind ran on the consequences of traumatic neurasthenia. He put on his hat and overcoat and unbolted the front door as silently as he could, for he still did not want anybody in the house to know the secret, and went out into the street. What to do? Ridiculous move. Did he expect to find her lying in the gutter? He walked to the end of the dark street and peered into the cross street, and returned. He had left the front door open. As he re-entered the house he descried in a corner of the hall a screwed-up telegraph envelope. Why had he not noticed it before? He snatched at it. It was addressed to Mrs Prohack. Mr Prohack's soul was instantaneously bathed in heavenly solace. Traumatic neurasthenia had nothing to do with Eve's disappearance. His bliss was intensified by the fact that she had said not a word to the servants and had not called Sissy, and it was somewhat impaired by the other fact that he had been ass enough to tell the police. He was just puzzling his head to think what misfortune could have called his wife away. Not that the prospect of any misfortune much troubled him now that Eve's vanishing was explained, when through the doorway he saw a taxi drive up. Eve emerged from the taxi. 2. He might have gone out and paid the fare for her, but he stayed where he was in the doorway, thinking with beatific relief that after all nothing had happened in the family. "Ah," he said in the most ordinary, complacent, quite undisturbed tone, "I was just beginning to wonder where you got to. We've been back about 5 minutes, Sissy and I, and Sissy's gone to bed. I really don't believe she knows you were out." Mrs Prohack came urgently towards him, pushing the door to behind her with a careless, loud bang. The bang might waken the entire household, but Mrs Prohack did not care. Mrs Prohack kissed him without a word. He possessed in his heart a barometric scale of her kisses, and this was a set fair kiss, a kiss with a somewhat violent beginning and a reluctant close. Then she held her cheek for him to kiss. Both cheek and lips were freshly cold from the night air. Mr Prohack was aware of an immense romantic felicity, and he immediately became flippant, not aloud, but secretly, to hide himself from himself. He thought, "It's a positive fact that I've been kissing this girl of a woman for a quarter of a century, and she's fat." But beneath his flippancy and beneath his felicity there was a lancinating calm, which, if he had expressed it, he would have expressed thus: "If anything did happen to her, it would be the absolute ruin of me." The truth was that his felicity frightened him. Never before had he been seriously concerned for her well-being. The reaction from grave alarm lightened up the interior of his mysterious soul with a revealing flash of unique intensity. "What are all these lights burning for?" she murmured. Lights were indeed burning everywhere. He had been in a mood to turn on, but not to turn off. "Oh," he said, I was just wandering about." "I'll go straight upstairs," she said, trying to be as matter-of-fact as her Arthur appeared to be. When he had leisurely set the whole of the ground floor to rights, he followed her. She was waiting for him in the boudoir. She had removed her hat and mantle, and lighted one of the new radiators, and was sitting on the sofa. "There came a telegram from Charlie," she began. "I was crossing the hall just as the boy reached the door, so I opened the door myself. It was from Charlie to say that he would be at the Grand Babylon Hotel tonight." "Charlie? The Grand Babylon? Not Buckingham Palace?" Eve ignored his crude jocularity. "It seems I ought to have received it early in the afternoon. I was so puzzled I didn't know what to do. I just put all my things on and went off to the hotel at once. It wasn't till after I was in the taxi that I remembered I ought to have told the servants where I was going. That's why I hurried back. I wanted to get back before you did. Charlie suggested telephoning from the hotel, but I wouldn't let him on any account." "Why not?" "Well, I thought you might be upset and wonder what on earth was going on." "What was going on?" Mr. Prohack repeated, gazing at her childlike, maternal, serious face, whose wistfulness affected him in an extraordinary way. "What on earth are you insinuating?" No, it was inconceivable that this pulsating girl perched on the sofa should be the mother of the mature and independent Charles. "Charlie's staying at the Grand Babylon Hotel," said Eve, as though she were saying that Charlie had forged a cheque or blown up the senator. Even the imperturbable man of the world in front of her momentarily blenched at the news. "More fool him," observed Mr. Brack. "Yes, and he's got a bedroom and a private sitting-room and a bathroom and a room for a secretary." "Hence a secretary," Mr. Prohack put in. "Yes, and a secretary. And he dictates things to the secretary all the time, and the telephone's always going. Yes, even at this time of night. He must be spending enormous sums. So of course I hurried back to tell you." "You did quite right, my pet," said Mr. Prohack. "A good wife should share these titbits with her husband at the earliest possible moment." He was really very like what in his more conventional moments he would have said a woman was like. If Eve had taken the affair lightly, he would without doubt have remonstrated, explaining that such an affair ought by no means to be taken lightly. But seeing that she took it very seriously, his instinct was to laugh at it, though in fact he was himself extremely perturbed by this piece of news, which confirmed, 100-fold, and in the most startling manner, certain sinister impressions of his own concerning Charlie's deeds in Glasgow. And he assumed the gay attitude, not from a desire to reassure his wife, but from mere contrariness. Positive the strangest husband that ever lived, and entirely different from normal husbands. Then he saw the tears hanging in Eve's eyes. Tears not of resentment against his lack of sympathy, tears of bewilderment and perplexity. She simply did not understand his attitude. And he sat down close by her on the sofa and solaced her with 3 kisses. She was singularly attractive in her alternations of sagacity and helplessness. "But it's awful," she whimpered. "The boy must be throwing money away at the rate of £20 or £25 a day." "Very probably," Mr. Prohack agreed. "Where's he getting it from?" she demanded. "He must be getting it from somewhere." "I expect he's made it. He's rather clever, you know." "But he can't have made money like that." "People do, sometimes." "Not honestly. You know what I mean, Arthur." This was an earthquaking phrase to come from a mother's lips. "And yet," said Mr. Prohack, "everything Charlie did used to be right for you." "But he's carrying on just like an adventurer. I've read in reports of trials about people carrying on just like that. A fortnight ago he hadn't got £50 cash in the world, and now he's living like a millionaire at the Grand Babylon Hotel. Arthur, what are you going to do about it? Couldn't you go and see him tonight?" "Now listen to me," Mr. Prohack began in a new tone, taking her hands. "Supposing I did go and see him tonight, what could I say to him?" "Well, you're his father." "And you're his mother. What did you say to him?" "Oh, I didn't say anything. I only said I should have been very glad if he could have arranged to sleep at home, as usual. And he said he was sorry he couldn't because he was so busy." "You didn't tell him he was carrying on like an adventurer?" "Arthur, how could I?" "But you'd like me to tell him something of the sort. All that I can say, you could say, and that is, inquire in a friendly way what he has done, is doing, and hopes to do." "But—" "Yes, my innocent creature, you may well pause." He caressed her, and she tried to continue in her happiness, but could not. "You pause because there is nothing to say." "You're his father, at any rate," she burst out triumphantly. "That's not his fault. You ought to have thought all this over 20 years ago, before Charlie was born, before we were married, before you met me. To become a parent is to accept terrible risks. I'm Charlie's father. Well, what then? Am I to give him orders as to what he must do and what he mustn't? This isn't China, and it isn't the 18th century. He owes nothing whatever to me or to you. If he was starving and he had plenty, he would probably consider it his duty to look after us. but that's the limit of what he owes us, whereas nothing can put an end to our responsibility towards him. You see, we brought him here. We thought it would be nice to have children, and so Charlie arrived. He didn't choose his time, and he didn't choose his character, nor his education, nor his chance. If he had his choice, you may depend he'd have chosen differently. Do you want me, on the top of all that, to tell him that he must immediately accept something else from us, our code of conduct? It would be mere cheek, and with all my shortcomings I'm incapable of impudence, especially to the young. He was our slave for nearly 20 years. We did what we liked with him. And if Charlie fails now, it simply means that we've failed. Besides, how can you be sure that he's carrying on like an adventurer? He may be carrying on like a financial genius. Perhaps we've brought a giant to earth. We can't believe it, of course, because we haven't got enough faith in ourselves, but later on we may be compelled to believe it. Naturally, if Charlie crashes after a showy flight, then he won't be a financial genius. He'll only be an adventurer. And there may be some slight trouble in the law courts. There usually is. That is where we shall have to come forward and pay for the nice feeling of having children. And remember, we shan't be in a position to upbraid Charlie. He could silence us with one question to which we could find no answer. Why did you get married, you two? However, my pet, let us hope for the best. It's not yet a crime to live at great price at the Grand Babylon Hotel. Quite possibly your son has not yet committed any crime whatever. If he succeeds in making a huge fortune and in keeping it, he will not commit any crime. Rich men never do. They can't. They never even commit murder. There's no reason why they should. Whatever they do, it is no worse than an idiosyncrasy. Now tell me what your son was talking about. Well, he didn't talk much. He wasn't expecting me. Did he ask after me? I told him about you. He asked about the car. He didn't ask after me, but he asked after the car. Nothing very original there, is there? Any son would behave like that. He must do better than that if he doesn't mean to end as an adventurer. I must go and see him and offer him, very respectfully, some advice. Arthur, I insist that he shall come here. It is not proper that you should go running after him. Pooh, my dear, I'm rich enough myself to run after him without being accused of snobbishness or lawn-hunting or anything of that kind. Oh, Arthur, sobbed Eve, don't you think you've been funny quite long enough? She then openly wept. The singular Mr. Prohack was apparently not in the least moved by his wife's tears. He and she alone in the house were out of bed. There was no chance of their being disturbed. He did not worry about his adventurous son. He did not worry about the possibility of Oswald Morphy having a desire to convert his daughter into Mrs. Oswald Morphy. He did not worry about the fate of the speculation in which he had joined Sir Paul Spinner. Nor did he worry about the malady called traumatic neurasthenia. As for himself, he fancied that he had not for years felt better than he felt at that moment. He was aware of the most delicious sensation of sharing a perfect nocturnal solitude with his wife. He drew her towards him until her acquiescent head lay against his waistcoat. He held her body in his arms, and came deliberately to the conclusion that to be alive was excellent. Eve's body was as yielding as that of a young girl. To Mr. Prohack, who of course was the dupe of an illusion, it had an absolutely enchanting girlishness. She sobbed, and Mr. Prohack left her sob. He loosed the grip of his arms a little, so that her face, free of his waistcoat, was turned upwards in the direction of the ceiling, and then he very caressingly wiped her eyes with his own handkerchief. He gave an elaborate care to the wiping of her eyes. For some minutes it was a Sisyphean labour, for what he did she immediately undid. But after a time the sobs grew less frequent, and at length they ceased. Only her lips trembled at intervals. Mr. Prohack said ingratiatingly, "And whose fault is it if I'm funny? Answer, you witch." "I don't know," Eve murmured tremblingly and not quite articulately. "It's your fault. Do you know that you gave me the fright of my life tonight, going out without saying where you were going to? Do you know that you put me into such a state that I've been telephoning to police stations to find out whether there had been any street accidents happening to a woman of your description? I was so upset that I daren't even go upstairs and call Sissy." "You said you'd only been back 5 minutes when I came," Eve observed in a somewhat firmer voice. "I did," said Mr. Prohack, "but that was neither more nor less than a downright lie. You see, I was in such a state that I had to pretend to both you and myself that things aren't what they are. And then without the slightest warning you suddenly arrive without a scratch on you. You aren't hurt. You aren't even dead. It's a scandalous shame that a woman should be able, by merely arriving in a taxi, to put a sensible man into such a paroxysm of satisfaction as you put me into a whole while ago. It's not right. It's not fair. Then you try to depress me with bluggy stories of your son's horrible opulence. And when you discover you can't depress me, you burst into tears and accuse me of being funny. What did you expect me to be? Did you expect me to groan because you aren't lying dead in a mortuary? If I'm funny, you are at liberty to attract it to hysteria, the hysteria of joy. But I wish you to understand that these extreme revulsions of feeling which you impose on me are very dangerous for a plain man who is undergoing a rest cure." Eve raised her arms about Mr. Prohack's neck, lifted herself up by them, and silently kissed him. Then she sank back to her former position. "I've been a great trial to you lately, haven't I?" she breathed. "Not more so than usual," he answered. "You know you always abuse your power." "But I have been queer." "Well," judiciously, "perhaps you have. Perhaps 5% or so above your average of queerness." "Didn't the doctor say what I got was traumatic neurasthenia?" "That, or something equally absurd." "Well, I haven't got it any more. I'm cured. You'll see." Just then the dining-room clock entered upon its lengthy business of chiming the hour of midnight. And as it faintly chimed, Mr. Prohack, supporting his wife, had a surpassing conviction of the beauty of existence, and in particular of his own good fortune, though the matter of his inheritance never once entered his mind. He gazed down at Eve's ingenuous features, and saw in them the fastidious fineness which had caused her to recoil so sensitively from her son's display of the Grand Babylon. Yes, women had a spiritual beauty to which men could not pretend. "Arthur," said she, "I never told you you'd forgotten to wind up that clock on Sunday night. It stopped this evening while you were out, and I had to wind it, and I only guessed what the time was." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Mr. Prohack by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 12. The Practice of Idleness. 1. At 10 minutes to 11 the next morning, Mr. Prohack rushed across the pavement and sprang head first into the original Eagle, now duly repaired, with the velocity and agility of a man long accustomed to the fact that seconds are more precious than sixpences and minutes than banknotes. And Carthew slammed the door on him like a conjurer performing the final act of a trick before an audience of 3,000 people. Mr. Prohack was late. He was late on this, the first full day of his career as a consciously and scientifically idle man. Carthew knew that his employer was late, and certainly the people in his house knew that he was late. Mr. Prohack's breakfast in bed had been late, which meant that his suggestive and reposeful hour of newspaper reading was thrown forward. And then he had actually been kept out of his own bathroom through the joint fault of Sissy and her mother, who had apparently determined to celebrate Sissy's definite release from the dance studio, and Mrs. Prohack's astonishing recovery from traumatic neurasthenia, by a thorough visitation and reorganization of the house and household. Those two, re-established in each other's affection, had been holding an inquisition in the bathroom, of all rooms, at the very moment when Mr. Prohack needed the same, with the consequence that he found the bath empty instead of full, and the geyser not even lighted. Yet they well knew that he had a highly important appointment at the tailor's at 10:45, followed by other just as highly important appointments. The worst of it was that he could not take their crime seriously, because he was on such intimate and conspiratorial terms with each of them separately. On the previous evening he had exchanged wonderful and rather dangerous confidences with his daughter, and further on, in the night, he and her mother had decided that the latter's fantastic excursion to the Grand Babylon Hotel should remain a secret. And Sissy, as much as her mother, had taken advantage of his helplessness in the usual unscrupulous feminine manner. They went so far as to smile quasi-maternally at his boyish busyness. Now, no sooner had Carthew slammed the door of the Eagle and got into the driving seat, than a young woman, a perfect stranger to Mr. Prohack, appeared, and through the open window asked in a piteous childlike voice if Mr. Prohack was indeed Mr. Prohack, and having been informed that this was so, expressed the desire to speak with him. Mr. Prohack was beside himself with annoyance and thwarted energy. Was the entire universe uniting against the execution of his programme? "I have a most important appointment," said he, raising his hat and achieving politeness by an enormous effort, "and if your business is urgent, you'd better get into the car. I'm going to Conduit Street." She slipped into the car like a snake, and Carthew, beautifully unaware that he had two passengers, simultaneously drove off. If a snake, she was a very slim, blushing, and confused snake, short, too, for a python, and she had a turned-up nose, and was quite young. Her scales were stylish, and although certainly abashed, apprehensive, and timorous, she yet had, about her delicate mouth, the signs of terrible determination, of ruthlessness, of an ambition that nothing could thwart. Mr. Prohack might have been alarmed, but fortunately he was getting used to driving in closed cars with young women, and so could keep his nerve. Moreover, he enjoyed these experiences, being a man of simple tastes and not too analytical of good fortune when it came his way. "It's very good of you to see me like this," said the girl, in the voice of a rapid brook with a pebbly bed. "My name is Winstock, and I've called about the car." "The car? What car?" "The motor-car accident at Putney, you know." "Ah, yes. Just so, just so. You are the owner-driver of the other car." "Yes." "I think you ought to have seen my wife. It was really she who is the owner of this car. As you are aware, I wasn't in the accident myself, and I don't know anything about it. Besides, it's entirely in the hands of the insurance company and the solicitors. You are employing a solicitor, aren't you?" "Oh, yes." "Then I suppose it's by his advice that you've come to see me." "Well, I'm afraid it isn't." "What?" cried Mr. Prohack. "If it isn't by his advice, you may well be afraid. Do you know you've done a most improper thing? Most improper. I can't possibly listen to you. You may go behind your lawyer's back, but I can't. And also there's the insurance company." Mr. Prohack lifted the rug which had fallen away from her short skirts. "I think solicitors and companies and things are so silly," said Miss Winstock, whose eyes had not moved from the floor-mat. "Thank you." The thank you was in respect to the rug. "So they are," Mr. Brack agreed. "That was why I thought it would be better to come straight to you." For the first time she glanced at him, a baffling glance, a glance that somehow had the effect of transferring some of the apprehension in her own breast to that of Mr. Prohack. "Well," said he, in a departmental tone recalling Whitehall, "will you kindly say what you have to say?" "Can I speak confidentially?" Mr. Prohack raised his hands and laughed in what he hoped was a sardonic manner. "Ah, I give you young women up," he murmured. "Yes, I give you up. You're my enemy. We're at law, and you want to talk confidentially. How can I tell whether I can let you talk confidentially until I've heard what you're going to say?" "Oh, I was only going to say that I'm not really the owner-driver of the car. I'm personal secretary to Mr. Carroll Quire, and it's really his car. You see, he has 3 cars, but as there's been such a fuss about waste lately, and he's so prominent in the anti-scondomania campaign, he prefers to keep only 1 car in his own name." "You don't mean to sit there and tell me you're talking about the Secretary for Foreign Affairs?" "Yes, of course. Who else? You know he's on the Continent at present. He wouldn't take me with him because he wanted to create an effect of austerity in Paris. That's what he said. And I must get this accident affair settled up before he comes back, or he may dismiss me. I don't think he will, because I'm a cousin of the late Lady Queenie Paul. That's how I got the place. But he may. And then where should I be? I was told you were so kind and nice. That's why I came." "I'm not kind, I am not nice," remarked Mr. Prohack in an acid tone, but laughing to himself, because the celebrated young statesman, Mr. Carroll Quire, bald at 35, was precisely one of the ministers who, during the war, had defied and trampled upon the Treasury. He now almost demoniacally contemplated the ruin of Mr. Carroll Quire. "You've made a serious mistake in coming to me. Unfortunately, you cannot undo it. Be good enough to understand that you have not been talking confidentially." Miss Winston ought to have been intimidated and paralyzed by the menacing manner of the former terror of the department, but she was not. "Please, please, Mr. Prohack," she said calmly, "don't talk in that strain. I distinctly told you I was talking confidentially, and I'm sure I can rely on you, unless all that I've heard about you is untrue, which it can't be. I only want matters to be settled quietly, and when Mr. Quire returns he will pay anything that has to be paid, if it isn't too much. My chauffeur asserts that you have told a most naughty untruth about the accident. You say that he ran into you, whereas the fact is that he was nearly standing still while you were going too fast, and you skidded badly into him off the tram lines. And he's found witnesses to prove what he says." "I may have been a little mistaken," Miss Winstock admitted with light sadness. "I won't say I wasn't. You know how you are in an accident." "I've never been in an accident in my life," Mr. Prohack objected. "If you had, you'd sympathize with me." At this moment the Eagle drew up at the desired destination in Conduit Street. Mr. Prohack looked at his watch. "I'm sorry to seem inhospitable," he said, "but my appointment is extremely important. I cannot wait." "Can I wait?" Mrs. Winstock suggested. "I'm quite used to waiting for Mr. Carroll Quire. If I might wait in the car till you came out. You see, I wanted to come to an understanding." "I don't know how long I shall be." "That doesn't matter, truly. I haven't got anything else in the world to do, as Mr. Carroll Quire is away." Mr. Prohack left Miss Winstock in the car. The establishment into which Mr. Prohack disappeared was that of his son's tailors. He slipped into it with awe, not wholly because the tailors were his son's tailors, but in part because they were tailors to various august, or once august, personages throughout Europe. Till that day Mr. Prohack had bought his clothes from an insignificant though traditional tailor in Maddox Street, to whom he had been taken as a boy by his own father. And he had ordered his clothes hastily, negligently, anyhow, in intervals snatched from meal hours, or on the way from one more important appointment to another more important appointment. Indeed, he thought no more of ordering a suit than of ordering a whisky and soda. Nay, he had on one occasion fallen incredibly low, and his memory held the horrid secret forever. On one occasion he had actually bought a ready-made suit. It had fitted him, for he was slimmish and of a good stock size, but he had told nobody, not even his wife, of this shocking defection from the code of true British gentlemanliness, and he had never repeated the crime. The secret would die with him. And now he was devoting the top of the morning to the commandment of a suit. The affair was his chief business, and he had come to it in a great car whose 6 cylinders were working harmoniously for nothing else, and with the aid of an intelligent and experienced and expert human being whose sole object in life that morning was to preside over Mr. Prohack's locomotion to and from the tailors. 2. Mr. Prohack perceived that he was only beginning to comprehend the wonder of existence. The adepts of the tailors, however, seemed to think nothing wonderful in the matter. They showed surprise that he had written to make an appointment with a particular adept named Melchizedek, who had been casually mentioned weeks earlier by Charles as the one man in London who really comprehended waistcoats. They took it as a matter of course that Mr. Prohack had naught else to do with the top of the morning but order clothes, and that while he did so he should keep a mature man and a vast and elaborate machine waiting for him in the street outside. And Mr. Melchizedek's manner alone convinced Mr. Prohack that what he had told his family, and that what he had told Miss Winstock in the car, was strictly true, and not the invention of his fancy, namely, that the appointment was genuinely of high importance. Mr. Melchizedek possessed the strange gift of condescending majestically to Mr. Prohack while licking his boots. He listened to Mr. Prohack as to an autocrat, while giving Mr. Prohack to understand that Mr. Prohack knew not the first elements of sartorial elegance. At intervals he gazed abstractedly at the gold-framed and crowned portraits that hung on the walls, and at the inscriptions similarly framed and crowned and hung, and it was home in upon Mr. Prohack that the inscriptions in actual practice referred to Mr. Melchizedek, and that this same Melchizedek, fawning and masterful, had seen monarchs in their shirt-sleeves, and spoken to princes with pins in his mouth, and made marks in white chalk between the shoulder-blades of grand dukes, and that revolutions and cataclysms were nothing to Mr. Melchizedek. When Mr. Melchizedek had decided by hypnotic suggestion and magic power what Mr. Prohack desired in the way of stuffs and patterns, he led Mr. Prohack mysteriously to a small chamber, and a scribe followed them carrying pencil and paper, and Mr. Prohack removed, with assistance, his shabby coat and his waistcoat, and Mr. Melchizedek measured him in unexampled detail and precision, and the scribe, writing, intoned aloud all Mr. Prohack's dimensions. And all the time Mr. Brack was asking in his heart, "How much will these clothes cost?" And he, once the terror of the departments, who would have held up the war to satisfy his official inquisitiveness on a question of price, he dared not ask how much the clothes would cost. He felt that in that unique establishment money was simply not mentioned. It could never be more than the subject of formal and stately correspondence. During the latter part of the operation, Mr. Prohack heard, outside in the shop, the sharp sounds of an imperial and decisive voice, and he was thereby well-nigh thunderstruck. And even Mr. Melchizedek seemed to be similarly affected by the voice, so much so that the intimate of sovereigns unaffectedly hastened the business of enduing Mr. Prohack into the shameful waistcoat and coat, and then, with a gesture of apology, passed out of the cubicle, leaving Mr. Prohack with the attendant scribe. Mr. Prohack, pricked by a fearful curiosity, followed Mr. Melchizedek, and the voice was saying, Mr. Prohack had cautiously approached. The moment had awkwardness, but Mr. Prohack owed it to himself to behave with all presence of mind. "Hello, Charlie," said he casually. "Hello, Dad. How are you?" And Charlie, wearing the very suit in which he had left home for Glasgow, shook hands boyishly. Looking into his firm, confident eyes, Mr. Prohack realized, perhaps for the first time, that the fruit of his loins was no common boy. The mere fact that an out-of-work ex-officer, precariously making a bit in motorcycle deals, he had dared to go to Melchizedek's firm for clothes, and that he was now daring to affront Melchizedek, this sole fact separated him from the ruck of sons. "I warn you, Dad, that if you're ordering clothes here, you're ordering trouble." Mr. Melchizedek's interjected remarks fitted to the occasion. The group dissipated. The males of the Prohack family could say nothing interesting to each other in such a situation. They could only pretend that their relations were purely normal, which they did quite well. "I say, Dad, I'm awfully busy this morning. I can't stop now. I've telephoned the mater, and she's coming to the Grand Babylon for lunch, 1:30. Sis too, I think. Do come. You haven't got anything else to do." The boy murmured all this. "Oh, haven't I? I'm just as busy as you are, and more." However, Mr. Prohack accepted the invitation. Charlie went off in haste. Mr. Prohack arrived on the pavement in time to see him departing in an open semi-racing car, driven by a mature, handsome, and elegant woman, with a chauffeur sitting behind. Mr. Prohack's mind was one immense interrogation concerning his son. He'd seen him, spoken with him, and, owing to the peculiar circumstances, learnt nothing whatever. Indeed, the mystery of Charlie was deepened. Had Charles hurried away in order to hide the mature, handsome lady from his father? Mr. Brack might have moralized, but he suddenly remembered that he had a lady in his own car, and that the disparity between their ages was no less than the disparity between the ages of the occupants of the car in which Charles had fled. 3. Turning to his own car, he observed with a momentary astonishment that Carthew, the chauffeur, leaning a little nonchalantly through the open off window of the vehicle, was engaged in conversation with Miss Winstock. The astonishment passed when he reflected that as these two had been in the enforced intimacy of an accident together, they were necessarily on some kind of speaking terms. Before Carthew had noticed Mr. Prohack noticed that Carthew's attitude to Miss Winstock showed a certain tolerant condescension, while Miss Winstock's girlish gestures were of a subtly appealing nature. Then, in an instant, Carthew, the easy male tolerator of inaccurate but charming young women, disappeared from the window, disappeared indeed entirely from the face of the earth, and a perfectly non-human, impassive automaton emerged from behind the back of the car and stood attentive at the door, holding the handle thereof. Mr. Prohack, with a gift of dissimulation equal to Carthew's own, gave him an address in Bond Street. "I have another very urgent appointment," said Mr. Prohack to Miss Winstock as he sat down beside her, and he took his diary from his pocket and gazed at it intently, frowning, though there was nothing whatever on its page except the printed information that the previous Sunday was the 24th after Trinity, and a warning, "If you have omitted to order your new diary, it would be well to do so now, to prevent disappointment." "It's awfully good of you to have me here," said Miss Winstock. "It is," Mr. Prohack admitted, "and so far as I can see you've done nothing to deserve it. You were very wrong to get chatting with my chauffeur, for example." "I felt that all the time, but he has such a powerful individuality." "He may have, but what I pay him for is to drive my car, not to put his passengers into a semi-hypnotic state. Do you know why I am taking you about like this?" "I hope it's because you are kind-hearted." "Not at all. Do you think I should do it if you were 50, fat, and a fright? Of course I shouldn't. And no one knows that better than you. I'm doing it because you're young and charming and slim and attractive and smart. Though 46, I'm still a man. The chief difference between me and most other men is that I know and openly admit my motives. That's what makes me so dangerous. You should beware of me. Take note that I haven't asked you what you've been saying to Carthew, nor shall I ask him. Now what exactly do you want me to do?" "Only not to let the law case about the accident go any further." "And are you in a position to pay the insurance company for the damage to my car?" "Oh, Mr. Carroll-Quire will pay." "Are you sure? Are you quite sure that Mr. Carroll-Quire is not spending twice as much as his ministerial salary, that salary being the whole of his financial resources except loans from millionaires who will accept influence instead of interest?" "I won't inquire whether Mr. Carroll-Quire pays your salary regularly. If he does, it furnishes the only instance of regularity in the whole of his gorgeous career. If our little affair becomes public, it might ruin Mr. Carroll-Quire as a politician. At the least it would set him back for 10 years. And I am particularly anxious to ruin Mr. Carroll-Quire. In doing so, I shall accomplish a patriotic act." "Oh, Mr. Prohack!" "Yes, Mr. Carroll-Quire may be, probably is, a delightful fellow, but he's too full of brains, and he constitutes the gravest danger that has threatened the British Empire for 100 years. Hence it is my duty to ruin him if I get the chance, and I've got the chance. I don't see how he could survive the exposure of the simple fact that while preaching anti-waste he's keeping motor cars in the names of young women." The car had stopped in front of a shop, over whose door a pair of gilded animals like nothing in zoology were leaping amiably at each other. Miss Winstock began to search neurotically in a bag for a handkerchief. "This is the scene of my next appointment," Mr. Brack continued. "Would you prefer to leave me at once, or will you wait again?" Miss Winstock hesitated. "You'd better wait," Mr. Brack decided. "You'll be crying in 15 seconds, and your handkerchief is sadly inadequate to the crisis. Try a little self-control, and don't let Carthew hypnotize you. I shan't be surprised if you've gone when I've come back." A commissionaire was now holding open the door of the car. "Carthew," said Mr. Prohack privily, after he got out, "oblige me by imagining that during my absence the car is empty." Carthew quivered for a fraction of eternity, but was exceedingly quick to recover. "Yes, sir." The shop was all waxed parquetry, silks, satins, pure linen, and pure wool, diversified by a few walking-sticks and a cuff-link or so. Faced by a judge-like middle-aged authority in a frock-coat, Mr. Prohack suddenly lost the magisterial demeanour which he exhibited to a defenceless girl in the car. He comprehended in a flash that suits of clothes were a detail in the existence of an idle man, and that neckties and similar supremacies alone mattered. "I want a necktie," he began gently. "Certainly, sir," said the judge. But the judge's eyes, fixed on Mr. Prohack's neck, said, "I should just think you did." Life was enlarged to a bewildering, a maddening, maze of neckties. Mr Brack considered in his heart that one of the needs of the day was an encyclopedia of neckties. As he bought neckties, he felt as foolish as a woman buying cigars. Any idiot could buy a suit, but neckties baffled the intelligence of the terror of the departments, though he had worn something in the nature of a necktie for 40 years. The neckties which he bought inspired him with fear, the fear lest he might lack the courage to wear them. In a nightmare he saw himself putting them on in his bedroom and proceeding downstairs to breakfast, and then, panic-stricken, rushing back to the bedroom to change into one of his old neckties. And when he had bought neckties, he apprehended that neckties without shirts were like butter without bread, and he bought shirts. And then he surmised that shirts without collars would be indecent. And when he bought collars, a still small voice told him that the logical foundation of all things was socks, and that really he had been trying to build a house from the 4th story downwards. Fortunately, he had less hesitation about the socks, for he could comfort himself with the thought that socks did not jump to the eye as neckties did, and that by constant care their violence might even be forever concealed from the gaze of his household. He sighed with relief at the end of the sock episode, but he had forgotten braces, as to which he surrendered unconditionally to the frock-coated judge. He brooked the most astounding braces, for none but Eve would see them, and he could intimidate Eve. "Shall we make you a 25 pairs to measure, sir?" This extraordinary question miraculously restored all Mr Prohack's vanished aplomb. That at the end of the greatest war in the history of the earth, amid decapitated empires and cities of starvation, braces should be made to measure. This was too much for Mr Prohack, who had not dreamed that braces ever had been made to measure. It shocked him back into sense. "No," he said coldly, and soon afterwards left the shop. Miss Winstock, in the car, sat for the statue of wistful melancholy. "Heavens," breathed Mr Prohack to himself, "the little thing is taking me seriously. With all her experience of the queer world and all her initiative and courage, she is taking me seriously." He was touched. His irony became sympathetic, and he thought, "How young the young are!" Her smile, as he rejoined her, had pathos in it. The totality of her was delicious. "You cannot be all bad, Miss Winstock," said he to her, after instructing the chauffeur, "because nobody is. You are undisciplined. You do wild and rash things. You have already accomplished several this morning. But you have righteous instincts, though not often enough. Of course, with one word to the insurance company I could save you. The difficulty is that I could not save you without saving Mr Carroll Quire also. And it would be very wrong of me to save Mr Carroll Quire, for to save him would be to jeopardize the future of the British Empire, because unless he is scotched, that man's frantic egotism and ruthless ambition will achieve political disaster for 400 million human beings. I should like to save you, but can I weigh you in the balance against an empire? Can I say?" "No," answered Miss Winstock weakly but sincerely. "That's just where you're wrong," said Mr Prohack. "I can. And you are shamefully ignorant of history. Never yet, when empire, any empire, has been weighed in the balance against a young and attractive woman, has the young woman failed to win. That is a dreadful fact, but men are thus constituted. Had you been a hag, I should not have hesitated to do my duty to my country. But as you are what you are, and sitting so agreeably in my car, I will save you and let my country go." "Oh, Mr Prohack, you are very kind, but everyone told me you were." "No, I am a knave. Also, there is a condition." "I will agree to anything." "You must leave Mr Carroll Quire's service. That man is dangerous, not only to empires. The entire environment is the very worst decently possible for a girl like you. Get away from it. If you don't undertake to give him notice at once, and withdraw entirely from his set, then I will ruin both you and him." "But I shall starve," cried Miss Winstock. "I shall never find another place without influence, and I have no more influence." "Have the Winstocks no money?" "Not a penny." "And have the Pauls no money?" "None for me." "You are the idle programme girl in a theatre," said Mr Prohack. You will never starve. Excuse me for a few minutes. I have another very important appointment," he added, as the car stopped in Piccadilly. After a quarter of an hour spent in learning that suits were naught, neckties were naught, shirts, collars, socks, and even braces were naught, but that hats alone made a man of fashion and idleness, Mr. Brack returned to Miss Winstock and announced, "I will engage you as my private secretary. I need one very badly indeed. In fact, I cannot understand how, with all my engagements, I have been able to manage without one so long. Your chief duties will be to keep on good terms with my wife and daughter, and not to fall in love with my son. If you were not too deeply preoccupied with my chauffeur, you may have noticed a young man who came out of the tailor's just before I did. That was my son." "Oh," exclaimed Miss Winstock, "the boy who drove off in Lady Massulam's car?" "Was that Lady Massulam?" asked Mr. Prohack, before he had time to recover from the immense effect of hearing the startling, almost legendary name of Lady Massulam in connection with his son. "Of course," said Miss Winstock. "Didn't you know?" Mr. Prohack ignored her pertness. "Well," he proceeded, having now successfully concealed his emotion, "after having dealt as I suggest with my wife and children, you will deal with my affairs. You shall have the same salary as Mr. Carroll Quire paid, or forgot to pay. Do you agree or not?" "I should love it," replied Miss Winstock with enthusiasm. "What is your Christian name?" "Mimi." "So it is, I remember now. Well, it won't do at all. Never mention it again, please." When he had accompanied Mimi to a neighbouring post office and sent off a suitable telegram of farewell to Mr. Carroll Quire in her name, Mr. Prohack abandoned her till the morrow, and drove off quickly to pick up his wife for the Grand Babylon lunch. "I am a perfect lunatic," said he to himself. "Must be the effect of riches. However, I don't care." He meant that he didn't care about the conceivable consequences of engaging Mimi Winstock as secretary. But what he did care about was the conjuncture of Lady Massulam and Charlie. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Mr. Prohack by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 13. Further Idleness. 1. Strange, inconceivable as it may appear to people of the great world and readers of newspapers, Mr. Prohack, C.B., had never in his life before been inside the Grand Babylon Hotel. Such may be the narrow and mean existence forced by circumstances upon secretly powerful servants of the Crown. He arrived late, owing to the intricate preparations of his wife and daughter for Charlie's luncheon. These two were so unsuccessfully pretending not to be nervous, and their nervousness reacted upon Mr. Prohack, who perceived with disgust that his gay and mischievous mood of the morning was slipping away from him, despite his efforts to retain it. He knew now definitely that his health had taken the right turn, and yet he could not prod the youthful Sissy as he had prodded the youthful Mimi Winstock. Moreover, Mimi was a secret which would have to be divulged, and this secret not only weighed heavy within him, but seemed disturbingly to counterbalance the secrets that Charlie was withholding. On the present occasion he saw little of the Grand Babylon, for as soon as he mentioned his son's name to the nonchalant official behind the inquiry counter, the official changed like lightning into an obsequious courtier, and Charles's family was put in charge of a hovering attendant boy, who escorted it in a lift and along a mile of corridors, and Charlie's family was kept waiting at a door until the voice of Charlie permitted the boy to open the door. A rather large parlour, set with a table for 5, a magnificent view from the window of a huge white-bricked wall, and scores of chimney-pots and electric wires, and a moving grey sky above. Charlie, too, was unsuccessfully pretending not to be nervous. "Hello, kid," he greeted his sister. "Hello yourself," responded Sissy. They shook hands. They very rarely kissed. However, Charlie kissed his mother. Even he would not have dared to kiss her. "Mater," said he, "let me introduce you to Lady Massulam." Lady Massulam had been standing in the window. She came forward with a pleasant, restrained smile, and made the acquaintance of Charlie's family, but she was not talkative. Her presence, coming as a terrific surprise to the ladies of the Prohack family, and as a fairly powerful surprise to Mr. Prohack, completed the general constraint. Mrs. Prohack, indeed, was somewhat intimidated by it. Mrs. Prohack's knowledge of Lady Massillem was derived exclusively from the Daily Picture, where her portrait was constantly appearing on all sorts of pretexts, and where she was described as a leader of London society. Mr. Prohack knew of her as a woman credited with great feats of war work, and also with a certain real talent for organization. Further, he had heard that she had a gift for high finance, and exercised it not without profit. As she happened to be French by birth, no steady English person was seriously upset by the fact that her matrimonial career was obscure, and as she happened to be very rich, everybody raised sceptical eyebrows at the assertion that her husband, a knight, was dead. For the Daily Picture implanted daily in the minds of millions of readers the grand truth that to the very rich nothing can happen simply. The whole Daily Picture world was aware that of late she had lived at the Grand Babylon Hotel in permanence. That world would not have recognized her from her published portraits, which were more historical than actual. Although conspicuously anti-Victorian, she had a Victorian beauty of the impressive kind. She had it still. Her hair was of a dark, lustrous brown, and showed no grey. In figure she was tall, and rather more than plump, and rather less than fat. Her perfect and perfectly worn clothes proved that she knew just how to deal with herself. She would look 40 in a theatre, 50 in a garden, and 60 to her maid at dawn. This important person spoke, when she did speak, with a scarcely perceptible French accent, in a fine, clear voice. But she spoke little, and said practically nothing, which was a shock to Marian Prohack, who had imagined that in the circles graced by Lady Massillem conversation varied from badinage to profundity, and never halted. It was not that Lady Massillem was tongue-tied, nor that she was impolite. It was merely that with excellent calmness she did not talk. If anybody handed her a subject, she just dropped it. The floor around her was strewn with subjects. The lunch was dreadful, socially. It might have been better if Charlie's family had not been tormented by the tremendous question, what had Charlie to do with Lady Massillem? Already Charlie's situation was sufficient of a mystery, without this arch mystery being spread all over it. And inexperienced Charlie was a poor host. As a host he was positively pathetic, rivalling Lady Massillem in taciturnity. Sissy took to chaffing her brother, and after a time Charlie said suddenly with curtness, "Have you dropped that silly dance scheme of yours, kid?" Sissy was obliged to admit that she had. "Then I tell you what you might do. You might come and live here with me for a bit. I'm what a hostess, you know." "I will," said Sissy straight. No consultation of parents. This brief episode overset Mrs. Prohack. The lunch worsened to such a point that Mr. Prohack began to grow light-hearted, and chaffed Charlie in his turn. He found material for chaff in the large number of newly bought books that were lying about the room. There was even the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics in 11 volumes. Queer possessions for a youth who at home had never read aught the periodical literature of automobilism. Could this be the influence of Lady Massillem? Then the telephone bell rang, and it was like a signal of salvation. Charlie sprang at the instrument. "For you," he said, indicating Lady Massillem, who rose. "Oh," said she, "it's Ozzy." "Who's Ozzy?" Charlie demanded without thought. "No doubt Oswald Morphy," said Mr. Prohack, scoring over his son. "He wants to see me. May I ask you to come up for coffee?" "Oh, do," said Sissy, also without thought. She then blushed. Mr. Prohack thought suspiciously and apprehensively, "I better think he's found out that my daughter is here." Ozzy transformed the final act of the luncheon. An adept conversationalist, he created conversationalists on every side. Mrs. Prohack liked him at once. Sissy could not keep her eyes off him. Charlie was impressed by him. Lady Massillem treated him with the familiarity of an intimate. Mr. Prohack alone was sinister in attitude. Ozzy brought the great world into the room with him. In his simpering voice he was ready to discuss all the phenomena of the universe. But after 10 minutes Mr. Prohack noticed that the fellow had one sole subject on his mind, namely, a theatrical first night, fixed for that very evening, a first night of the highest eminence, one of Mr Asprey-Chown's first night, boomed by the marvellous showmanship of Mr Asprey-Chown into a mighty event. The competition for seats was prodigious, but of course Lady Massillon had obtained her usual stall. "What a pity we can't go," said Cissy simply. "Will you all come in my box?" astonishingly replied Mr Oswald Morphy, embracing in his weak glance the entire Prohack family. "The fellow came here on purpose to fix this," said Mr Prohack to himself, as the matter was being effusively clinched. "I must go," said he aloud, looking at his watch. "I have a very important appointment." "But I wanted to have a word with you, Dad," said Charlie, in quite a new tone, across the table. "Possibly," answered the superior ironic father in Mr Prohack, who, besides being sick of the luncheon party, was determined that nothing should interfere with his Median and Persian programme. "Possibly, but that will be for another time." "Well, to-night, then," said Charlie, dashed somewhat. "Perhaps," said Mr Prohack. Yet he was burning to hear his son's word. 2. However, Mr Prohack did not succeed in loosing himself from the embraces of the Grand Babylon Hotel for another 30 minutes. He offered to abandon the car, to abandon everything to his wife and daughter, and to reach his next important appointment by the common methods of conveyance employed by common people. But the ladies would permit no such thing. They announced their firm intention of personally escorting him to his destination. The party seemed to be unable to break up. There was a considerable confabulation between Eve and Lady Massillon at the entrance to the lift. Mr Prohack noticed anew that Eve's attitude to Lady Massillon was still a flattering one. Indeed, Eve showed that in her opinion the meeting with so great a personage as Lady Massillon was not quite an ordinary episode in her simple existence. And Lady Massillon was now talking with a free flow to Eve. As soon as the colloquy had closed, and Eve had at length joined her simpering husband in the lift, Charlie must have a private chat with Lady Massillon, apart, mysterious, concerning their affairs, whatever their affairs might be. In spite of himself, Mr Prohack was impressed by the demeanour of the young man and the mature blossom of womanhood to each other. They exhibited a mutual trust. They understood each other. They liked each other. She was more than old enough to be his mamma, and yet as she talked to him she somehow became a dignified girl. Mr Prohack was disturbed in a manner which he would never have admitted. How absurd to fancy that Lady Massillon had in her impressive head a notion of marrying the boy! Still, such unions had occurred. But he was pleasantly touched, too. Then Oswald Morphy and Cissy made another couple, very different, more animated, and equally touching. Ozzy seemed to grow more likeable and less despicable under the honest and frankly ardent gaze of Miss Prohack, and Mr Prohack was again visited by a doubt whether the fellow was after all the perfectly silly ass which he was reputed to be. In the lift, Lady Massillon having offered her final adieu, Ozzy opened up to Mrs Prohack the subject of an organisation called the United League of All the Arts. Mr Prohack would not listen to this. He hated leagues, and especially leagues of arts. He knew in the marrow of his spine that they were preposterous. But Mrs Prohack and Cissy listened with unfeigned eagerness to the wonderful tale of the future of the United League of All the Arts. And when, emerging from the lift, Mr Prohack strolled impatiently on ahead, the three stood calmly moveless to converse, until Mr Prohack had to stroll impatiently back again. As for Charlie, he stood by himself. There was leisure for the desired word with his father, but Mr Prohack had bluntly postponed that, and thus the leisure was wasted. Without consulting Mr Prohack's wishes, Ozzy drew the ladies towards the great lounge, and Mrs Prohack at a distance unwillingly after them. In the lounge, so abundantly enlarged and enriched since the days of the celebrated Felix Babylon, the founder of the hotel, post-lunch coffee was merging into afternoon tea. The number of idle persons in the world, and the number of busy persons who ministered to them, and the number of artistic persons who played voluptuous music to their idleness, struck Mr Prohack as merely prodigious. He had not dreamed that idleness on so grandiose a scale flourished in the city, which to him had always been a city of hard work and limited meal hours. He saw that he had a great deal to learn before he could hope to be as skilled in idleness as the lowest of these experts in the lounge. He tapped his foot warningly. No effect on his women. He tapped more loudly, as the hatred of being in a hurry took possession of him. Eve looked round with a delightful placatory smile, which conjured an answering smile into the face of her husband. He tried to be irritated after smiling, and advancing, said in a would-be fierce tone, "If this lunch lasts much longer, I shall barely have time to dress for dinner." But the effect was a failure, so complete that Sissy laughed at him. He had expected that in the car his women would relate to him the sayings and doings of Ozymandias in relation to the United League of all the Arts. But they said not a syllable on the matter. He knew they were hiding something formidable from him. He might have put a question, but he was too proud to do so. Further, he despised them because they essayed to discuss Milady Massulum impartially, as though she was just a plain body, or nobody at all. A nauseating pretence on their part. Crossing a street, the car was held up by a procession of unemployed, with guardian policemen, a band consisting chiefly of drums, and a number of collarless, powerful young men who shook white boxes of coppers menacingly in the faces of passers-by. "Instead of encouraging them, the police ought to forbid these processions of unemployed," said Eve gravely. "They're becoming a perfect nuisance." "Why," said Mr. Prohack, "this car of yours is a procession of unemployed." This sardonic pleasantry pleased Mr. Prohack as much as it displeased Mrs. Prohack. It seemed to alleviate his various worries, and the process of alleviation went further when he remembered that, though he would be late for his important appointment, he had really lost no time, because Dr. Vega had forbidden him to keep this particular appointment earlier than 2 full hours after a meal. "Don't take cold, darling," Eve urged with loving solicitude as he left the car to enter the place of rendezvous. Sissy grinned at him mockingly. They both knew that he had never kept such an appointment before. 3. Solemnity and hush and antique menials stiff with tradition surrounded him. As soon as he had paid the entrance fee and deposited all his valuables in a drawer, of which the key was formally delivered to him, he was motioned through a turnstile and requested to permit his boots to be removed. He consented. White linens were then handed to him. "See here," he said with singular courage to the attendant, "I have never been into one of these resorts before. Where do I go?" The attendant, who was a barefooted, mild child dressed in the Moorish mode, reassuringly charged himself with Mr. Prohack's well-being, and led the aspirant into a vast mosque with a roof of domes and little glowing windows of coloured glass. In the middle of the mosque was a pale green pool. White figures reclined in alcoves round the walls. A fountain played, the only orchestra. There was an Eastern sound of hands clapped, and another attendant glided across the carpeted warm floor. Mr. Prohack understood that, in this immense seclusion, when you desired no matter what, you clapped your hands and were served. A beautiful peace descended upon him and enveloped him, and he thought, "This is the most wonderful place in the world. I have been waiting for this place for 20 years. He yielded without reserve to its unique invitation. But some time elapsed before he could recover from the unquestionable fact that he was still within a quarter of a mile of Piccadilly Circus. From the explanations of the attendant, and from the precise orders which he had received from Dr. Vega regarding the right method of conduct in a Turkish bath, Mr. Prohack, being a man of quick mind, soon devised the order of the ceremonial suited to his case, and began to put it into execution. At first he found the ceremonial exacting. To part from all his clothes, and to parade through the mosque in attire of which the principal items were a towel and the key of his valuables adorning his wrist, was ever so slightly an ordeal to one of his temperament and upbringing. To sit unsheltered in blinding steam was not amusing, though it was exciting. But the steam chapel, as it might be called, of the mosque was a delight compared to the second next chapel further on, where the woodwork of the chairs was too hot to touch, and where a gigantic thermometer informed Mr. Brack that with only another 50 degrees of heat he would have achieved boiling point. He remembered that it was in this chamber he must drink iced tonic water in quantity. He clapped his streaming hands clammily, and a tall, thin old man, whose whole life must have been lived near boiling point, immediately brought the draught. Short of the melting of the key of his valuables, everything possible happened in this extraordinary chamber. But Mr. Prohack was determined to shrink from naught in the pursuit of idleness. And at length, after he had sat in a less ardent chapel, and in still another chapel been laid out on a marble slab as for an autopsy, and, defenceless, attacked for a quarter of an hour by a prize-fighter, and had jumped desperately into the ice-cold lake, and been dragged out and smothered in thick folds of linen, and finally reposed horizontal in his original alcove, then he was conscious of an inward and profound conviction that true, perfect, complete, and supreme idleness had been attained. He had no care in the world. He was cut off from the world. He had no family. He existed beatifically and individually in a sublime and satisfied egotism. But, such is the insecurity of human organisms and institutions, in less than 2 minutes he grew aware of a strange sensation within him, which sensation he ultimately diagnosed as hunger. To clap his hands was the work of an instant. The oncoming attendant recited a catalogue of the foods at his disposal, and the phrase Welsh rarebit caught his attention. He must have a Welsh rarebit. He had not had a Welsh rarebit since he was at school. It magically arrived on an oriental tray set on a low Moorish table. Eating the most wonderful food of his life and drinking tea, he looked about and saw that 2 of the unoccupied sofas in his alcove were strewn with garments. The owners of the garments had doubtlessly arrived during his absence in the chapels, and were now in the chapels themselves. He lay back. Earthly phenomena lost their harsh reality. When he woke up, the mosque was a pit of darkness glimmering with sharp points of electric light. He heard voices, the voices of 2 men who occupied the neighbouring sofas. They were discoursing to each other upon the difficulties of getting good whisky in Afghanistan and in Rio de Janeiro, respectively. From whisky they passed on to even more interesting matters. Mr. Prohack, for the first time, began to learn how the other half lives, to such an extent that he thought he had better turn on the lamp over his head. Whereupon the conversation on the neighbouring sofas curved off to the English weather in late autumn. Then Mr. Brack noticed a deep snore. He perceived that the snore originated in a considerable figure that, wrapped in white and showing to the mosque only a venerable head, was seated in one of the huge arm-chairs which were placed near the entrance to every alcove. It seemed to him that he recognized the snore, and he was not mistaken, for he had twice before heard it on Sunday afternoons at his chief club. The head was the head of Sir Paul Spinner. Mr. Prohack recalled that old Paul was a devotee of the Turkish bath. Now Mr. Prohack was exceedingly anxious to have speech with old Paul, for he had heard very interesting rumours of Paul's activities. He arose softly and approached the easy-chair, and surveyed Sir Paul, who in his then state looked less like a high financier and more like something chipped off the roof of a cathedral than anything that Mr. Prohack had ever seen. But Paul did not waken. A bather plunged into the pool with a tremendous splash, but Paul did not waken, and Mr. Prohack felt that it would be contrary to the spirit of the ritual of the mosque to waken him. But he decided that if he waited all night, he would wait until old Paul regained consciousness. At that moment an attendant asked Mr. Prohack if he desired the attentions of the barber, the chiropodist, or the manicurist. New vistas opened out before Mr. Prohack. He said yes. After the barber, he padded down the stairs from the barber's chapel, which was in the upper story of the mosque, to observe if there was any change in old Paul's condition. Paul still slept. Mr. Prohack did similarly after the chiropodist. Paul still slept. Then again after the manicurist. Paul still slept. Then a boyish attendant hurried forward, and in a very daring manner shook the monumental Paul by the shoulder. "You told me to wake you at 6, Sir Paul." And Paul woke. How simple, reflected Mr. Prohack, are the problems of existence when they are tackled with decision. Here have I been ineffectively trying to waken the fellow for the past hour, but I forgot that he who wishes the end must wish the means, and my regard for the ritual of the mosque was absurd. He retired into the alcove to dress. keeping a watchful eye upon old Paul. He felt himself to be in the highest state of physical efficiency. From head to foot he was beyond criticism. When Mr. Prohack got as far as his waistcoat, Sir Paul uprose ponderously from the easy-chair. "Hi, Paul." The encounter between the two friends was one of those affectionate and ecstatic affairs that can only happen in a Turkish bath. "I've been trying to get you on the phone half the day," grunted Paul Spinner, subsiding onto Mr. Prohack's sofa. "I've been out all day, horribly busy," said Mr. Prohack. "What's wrong? Anything wrong?" "Oh, no, only I thought you'd like to know I've finished that deal." "Why, I did hear some tall stories, but not a word from you, old thing." Mr. Prohack tried to assume a tranquillity which he certainly did not feel. "Well, I never sing out until I'm out of the wood, but this time I'm out sooner than I expected." "Any luck?" "Yes, but I dictated a letter to you before I came here." "I suppose you can't remember what there was in it?" "I shall get the securities next week." "What securities?" "Well, you'll receive—" Here Paul dropped his voice. 3,000 short of $250,000 in return for what you put in, my boy." "Then I'm worth over £250,000, murmured Mr. Prohack feebly. And he added still more feebly, "Something will have to be done about this soon." His heart was beating against his waistcoat like an engine. End of chapter 13.